Today, we're looking at Psalm chapter 25. It's an interesting psalm, and there's actually three things that David emphasized in the psalm, which may be challenging and somewhat surprising. One, he talks about shame a number of times. I believe he talks about shame four times. In verse 1 and 2, he mentions it three times. And then down in verse 20, as he's ending the psalm, he mentions it again. Most of us know what shame is without a definition. And there's a difference, I believe, between guilt and shame. Guilt, of course, is when we break some standard, some personal standard, or some moral code, or that we violate some principle. But shame takes you to a deeper level. Shame is a intense, painful emotional feeling, and the destructive thing about it is that it can creep in every corner of our lives. And it actually, believe it or not, can haunt one all the days of his life. So it's a very painful and destructive emotion, perhaps even the most. And so David is talking about avoiding shame, and not only avoiding it, but relieving it, shame, as he speaks to God. Interesting, I think, as I've already mentioned in our teaching on the Psalms and our prayers, how you can address God with all your emotions, and especially shame over some of the things that you perhaps have done. So let's look at shame for just a moment, and then I want you to think about how often he talks about waiting and teaching in the particular psalm. So in verse number 1, you'll see that he says, "Oh my God, I trust in thee. Let not me be ashamed. Let not my enemies triumph over me." Now, of course, in that verse, David is concerned about the enemies gaining the victory over him and having failure in that endeavor. It would bring him shame. And we can relate to that oftentimes because when we fail in something, uh, many times we're not just disappointed, but we feel greatly ashamed. Notice verse 3, "Yet let none that wait on me be ashamed, and let them be ashamed which transgress without cause." Now he's turning this in a way to those who are deliberately disobedient to God, who oppose God, who are God's enemy, and he's speaking about them that they would be ashamed. Now down in verse, what is it, verse 20, I believe it is, he'll talk about, "Oh, keep my soul and deliver me. Let me not be ashamed." And then he says, "For I put my trust in thee." Now, think about it for a moment. David doesn't want to face failure and be defeated and be ashamed. But in verse 7, he starts to talk about some inner turmoil. It's not the shame of failure, so to speak, but he talks about his past sins. As I've said before, some of the things that we've done in our youth, in the early days of life, we can do some things that we deeply regret. We try to cover them up. We try to keep silent. We don't want to be exposed about it. And David in verse number 7, look here, he says, "Remember not, or do not remember me, God, about the sins of my youth." Think about praying to God like that. "God, don't remember those sins that I've committed. Forgive them, and nor my transgressions." And that even takes it to a more, overt act. That is, when you transgress, you cross the boundary. So David is not just talking about innocent sins, but in our days of our youth, sometimes we do the most stupid things, and we don't realize in the days of our youth that we'll deeply regret that someday, and it would bring us a lot of shame if it was ever exposed. And that's true of everybody that's walked on the planet of the earth. And so he says to God, "Remember not the sins of my youth or my transgressions, according to thy mercy. Remember not for thy goodness' sake." Now we'll come back to that thought for just a moment, but go down to verse 11 if you're with me today, and notice what he says, "Because of your name," or because of your name's sake. You see where he is emphasizing and turning his plea to God, not that he's making an excuse for his sins and not denying his sins, but he goes to God. He says, "Pardon my iniquity, for it is great." And so, sometimes we've done some really, really bad things. And again, we go to God, we bring that to God, those things that were shameful to us. I have been saying all along in the Psalms, one of the things you can learn is that you can go to God about everything. You can talk to Him about things that you regret and things that you are ashamed of. And so it's an important verse, is it not? Now, down in verse number 13, I don't know if we've lost connection or not, but we're going to move on. His soul shall dwell at ease. Notice this, the comfort that comes from guilt and shame is turning to God, because not only does God forgive us, and I'm going to make a real important point here, not only does God forgive us, but He accepts us, and we can be quiet and be at ease and be secure. That's why He says His soul shall dwell with Him at ease, instead of being troubled and being turmoil and fretting and being haunted by it, knowing that God has forgiven you. Not only that, but He has accepted you. Notice verse 16. This is all about shame here. Turn unto thee. And see how oftentimes he's mentioning this whole business about shame and things that we've done that we regret and embarrassed over, things we feel disgraced about. Notice verse 16. Turn thee unto me and have mercy upon for me. Notice here how desolate he feels. That's the deep level of shame, for he says, I am desolate and afflicted. He's not talking about physical pain. Sometimes emotional pain can be much deeper and much more difficult to deal with it than even physical pain. Notice verse 13 again. I want you to see, because you might have been there, how intense and how shame has robbed you of so many things in life. And notice he says in verse 17, the troubles of my heart are enlarged. He's talking about all of that's going on inside him. And there he goes on to say, verse 18, look upon my affliction and my pain and forgive my sins. I'm just trying to get you to see very quickly here about how intense this feeling is of David and how emotional it is. And the only thing that he can do and the only thing he should do is turn to God. Now, that's the feeling of being shame. And notice the second thing, and this is challenging too, I think. He'll mention, I believe it's 3 times, about waiting. And we don't wait very well in America. In fact, we have a hard time waiting for anything. And when he talks about waiting, for instance, in verse 3, yet none that wait on thee be ashamed. Now, that's the idea of Romans 5:5. What Paul is saying over there is about this hope that God has given us. It's not a hope so like so many people use it. It's an expectation that we are certain of. That's why in Romans 5, in verse 5, he says that your hope will not be ashamed. We will not be disappointed because we put our hope in God, that we can trust Him. And by the way, that's really what underpins this whole business of waiting. So you're not going to trust, let's put it this way, you're not going to wait for somebody that you don't think is going to show up. You're not going to wait for someone whom you do not trust. I mean, you can wait if you have a trust. And by the way, if you really have trust, that changes the whole attitude in waiting, doesn't it? I mean, if you really know that God is going to come through, He's going to keep His word, you can wait. But if you don't trust somebody and you don't expect someone to show up and you don't expect something to happen, then waiting becomes very, very, very difficult. And that's the story of Saul, by the way. We don't have time to talk about Saul, but Saul, because of a crisis in his life, as they were fighting the Philistines, if you remember, panicked. He was supposed to wait, but he didn't wait because of what was going on. If he had trusted what Samuel had said, he would have waited right to the very end. So waiting in verse 3 is challenging, and again, it's challenging, especially in our generation where we want everything to be immediate. And And so you remember even Abraham had to wait a long, long time for that promise to be fulfilled. Now there's another verse here that he says in verse 21, let thy integrity and uprightness preserve me, I will wait on you. Now understand, because we can't preach on this today, but waiting is a statement of faith. Not only is it a statement of faith, that's how we can wait, and that's why we should wait, and why we ought not to grow weary in well doing, because we trust. Because we trust God, we are able to wait. It affects our attitude in waiting, and it also affects our conduct in our action in waiting. Isn't that profound? I mean, it will change the way you look at waiting if you have faith and trust in God. And the third thing, and I just don't have time to do it today, but the third thing he'll emphasize, and he emphasizes this just a bunch of times, at least 5, 6, 7 times, about the business of God teaching him. Now, we're living in a generation, where we don't think doctrine matters, and we're just kind of winging it sometimes religiously. And yet he'll talk about, verse 4, verse 5, verse 8, verse 12, verse 14, just a bunch of times where he's eager for God to teach him and instruct him by his word so he can walk in his ways. 3 things in that psalm are very, very important. One is to avoid shame, and then if there is shame, seek God's forgiveness and acceptance, and he will accept you. Number 2 is learning to wait, because we have to wait. Everything isn't just handed down to us immediately. And so waiting is an act of faith again. And then thirdly, the emphasis in the psalm, and you read it, how often he talks about God. He's eager for God to teach him, eager for God's word, that he may be able to walk in the ways of God, and God would guide his steps, and therefore avoid so much painful things in life and live such an abundant and fruitful life. Tremendous psalm, Psalm 25. I'll see you tomorrow at noon, and we'll be looking at Psalm chapter 26.